We have continued to see activity that leads us to believe that there's escalation that may be taking place. And so we're taking all the appropriate actions, both from a security perspective and well as our ability to make sure that the president has a wide range of options in the event that something should actually take place.
The Trump administration is revealing more about why it is sending the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group and an unnamed bomber task force to U.S. Central Command in the Middle East and the potential for war. Yesterday, Acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan tweeted that the deployment is in response to, quote, indications of a credible threat by Iranian regime forces. New intelligence also shows that Iran and its proxies are moving forces and may be planning for both land and sea attacks, according to U.S. officials and a defense official. After the U.S. designated the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization last month, Tehran responded by designating all U.S. troops in the Middle East as terrorists and the U.S. as a sponsor of terrorism. Joining us now, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, retired four-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis. He is Chief International Security and Diplomacy Analyst for NBC News and MSNBC.
Admiral, there have been reports over the past couple. By the way, I am your acting morning news host. Everybody's acting around here.
In a way.
There were news reports for the past few days that this military exercise had been planned for some time. What can you tell us?
It was planned for the Carrier Strike Group to move into the Arabian Gulf, but not for a few months. And as you know, Joe, we've had Carrier Strike Group in the Gulf for decades. I commanded the Enterprise Carrier Strike Group some years ago. These are massive machines of war. They carry 70 combat aircraft. They come with cruisers, missiles.
Right.
But it's pretty common to have one in there. What is different is coupling this speed-up deployment with the rhetoric. It is a significant escalation in that sense. We ought to be concerned about rising tension in the Arabian Gulf.
So, Admiral, do you see it as a credible threat that the Iranians would attack any U.S. forces?
I think it's very unlikely that there would be an overt attack against U.S. forces. Possibility of a terrorist strike, something under the radar, that's a possibility. Overt, very, very unlikely.
Yeah, and so does this seem to you most likely, although I understand as a military man or woman, you always have to prepare for the worst. Does this seem to you, on the surface at least, at first glance, to be more about Donald Trump just saber-rattling, playing to his political base at home instead of actually doing anything that's going to have long-term military consequences?
I would say every military deployment where you see a president reach for those aircraft carriers, there's always going to be a domestic component to it, Joe. I think in this particular case, when you look at the back and forth of us declaring the Iranian Revolutionary Guard terrorists, them declaring us terrorists, I think it's actually a prudent military move to accelerate that carrier deployment into the Gulf. But is there a domestic component? There always is.
So, Admiral, if you could continue to help us with our suspicion level here. The reports are that this move was made, the heightening up the accelerated pace of the carrier group. This move was made after new intelligence was received in Washington. Apparently, the intelligence came from Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency. The benefits would accrue to Saudi Arabia and Israel if we inject ourselves further in that situation in the Middle East. The National Security Advisor for the President, John Bolton, had a thundering response to this intelligence. So help calm this thing down for us, would you please? Because I think more than a few people are looking at this and saying,
Indeed. It certainly can get into your head, but let's look at the geopolitics of this for a second. If you see Iran, which it is, pushing throughout the limits of the ancient Persian Empire, the bulwark against that in the end is going to be Israel and our Arab allies. They're going to be the frontline states here. putting that carrier in as you see the Iranians kind of ramping up does make military sense. I think there is an ironic element to it in that this is the Lincoln Carrier Battle Group. Our American president, who was the most resolute in war, the most compassionate in peace. Interesting that would be, not to go all John Meacham on you here, but that would be an interesting angle to this.
Thanks for the warning.
Yeah, I think there is a right trigger statement ahead. I think there is a component here of domestic, but I think overall this one does pretty firmly fall into smart move internationally. The right elements are there to support it.
And don't worry, you didn't go all John Meacham on us.
You're good.
We're all still awake.
We would let you know.
I will say this, though, as we look at the international world and the arrival of the new prince, I have a nomination for a name which would be just so American. It would be Prince Joe Willie. Joe Willie.
Wow.
Joe Willie.
That has an
White shoes.
entirely
Joseph
different
William.
connotation in Great Britain when you throw the Willie in there.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you might step away from
Just
that.
back away slowly. I will
Really?
say, I want to underline twice, Willie, before passing over you, that the Admiral has said that this is the prudent military move to make. This is the wise military move to make, with Iranian aggression continuing throughout the region.
Yeah, and Admiral, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. We know John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, always has been a hawk on the question of Iran. We know that in April, Iran's Revolutionary Guard was designated as a terrorist organization. We also know that in testimony before the Senate in April as well, Secretary of State Pompeo had a back and forth with Rand Paul about the 2001 authorization of use of military force, where he effectively said he sees some connections between al-Qaeda and Iran, therefore implying that it may apply here to Iran. So as this carrier strike group moves in, it's happening in the middle of a process, not as the first step.
Precisely right. And so as we look at next moves here, what we ought to be thinking about is, A, how do we de-escalate this? Because the global flashpoint of the moment is really the Arabian Gulf. And it's not just Iran and the United States. It is the Saudis, the Gulf states, and it's part of this larger Shia-Sunni conflict in the Middle East. The ingredients are there for this to go sideways very quickly. We ought to try to de-escalate this, not ramp up the tension.
Yeah.
That's really the next right move here. And I am hopeful that we can do that if we use international approach here. And here's where we ought to be working more with our European allies, with whom we've managed to manufacture a real split in our policy toward Iran. That's not helping us a bit.
Caddy.
Admiral, I just wanted to ask you about what's going on in Turkey. I'm talking of other regimes that look increasingly autocratic, because now we have President Erdogan saying that he is going to have a rerun of mayoral elections that were held back in March, in which his party did very badly in Istanbul. What do you read into this in terms of an important NATO ally for the United States, if Erdogan really is going down this route of overturning it, what seem to have been free and fair election results, so that he can have a go in his favor?
Very concerning. Let's face it, we've been watching a slide in Turkey, moving away from democratic norms, imprisonment of the media, and co-option of the judiciary, intimidation at every level in the society. That's very concerning. And Istanbul is the heart of Turkish politics. So for President Erdogan to flip that is truly and deeply concerning for us. And by the way, it happens in the larger context of a Turkey that is buying increased advanced weapons from Russia, looking more toward relationships with Iran. See paragraph 1 about Iran. All of that ought to concern us. Here, what we ought to be doing is working closely within NATO to try and pull our Turkish friends and colleagues back, because they are good allies within the context of NATO. This is a setback in that relationship.
Admiral James Stavridis, thank you very much.
Thank you, Admiral. We will pass your suggestion on to the Queen.
Yep.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.